Today, as part of my Gardening Basics series, I'm going to be teaching you guys how to transplant tomatoes into your garden. So if you're new here, this is part of a series of videos I've been making explaining really basic gardening concepts. These are things that new gardeners wonder about. I know I wondered about, but when you listen to people who've been gardening for years, teaching gardening, they often don't mention these things because they've just been doing them for so long they forgot that it's not second nature or obvious how to do it. So I'm going to do a quick overview of transplanting in general, and then I'm going to talk about tomatoes specifically and what makes them different from a lot of plants that you might transplant. So transplanting, very basically, is taking a plant from the container that you started it inside in and putting it into the ground in either a raised bed or in your in-ground garden in the spot where it's going to live out the rest of its life. With most plants, ideally in this process, you're going to disturb the roots as little as possible. You're going to make sure you have containers where you can easily remove your plant from the container and then immediately insert it into the ground without disturbing the roots too much. However, you might find that if you let your plants go too long in too small of a container, they start to circle the bottom of the container like this. And so a general thing that you can do if you are messing with the roots at all, you're just going to very carefully kind of pull them out from that root bound position. And even if you don't do this, it's probably fine. This just sort of accelerates it, being able to reach out into the soil and explore a little faster than if you didn't do this. But like I said, in general, the rule that you want to follow is disturb the roots as little as possible when you're transplanting. Something like a tomato specifically, it can handle a little bit more than most plants in terms of root disturbedness. Things that are on the other end of the spectrum that can handle very little, if any, are things in the squash family. They really hate it when you mess with their roots. And then something like a carrot, you could never transplant because its root just will not tolerate being messed with once it's planted. So for most plants, you are taking your plant from little container and putting it in the ground, and you're going to put it in the dirt right up to soil level. And for a lot of plants, you don't ever want to go higher than soil level because burying the stem can sometimes cause the plant to rot. Now, tomatoes are different. Tomatoes, if you can see, have little hairs all along the stem. And even if you look right down here, you can see that some of those hairs are starting to form into little nodules. Tomatoes are kind of special in that they have the ability to grow roots all along the entire stem. And this is because tomatoes are actually vining plants. The way that we grow them straight up and support them is actually quite unnatural for them. Usually they will grow up and kind of flop over and put more roots and kind of vine out along the ground. Which is why you can bury tomatoes deeper than you could most plants, and it will actually benefit them rather than causing them to potentially rot. So something that a lot of people will do with tomatoes because of this is a couple of days before transplant, they will actually set their tomatoes on the side and let the plant naturally kind of grow up like this, and then they will plant the whole thing horizontally, covering a ton of stem without having to dig a really deep hole and giving it a bunch of places to put out new roots. You definitely don't have to do it that way. I'm not going to do it that way, but it can be an option. Now, you'll notice here at the bottom of my tomato are some really rather puny looking leaves, and you can just pluck those right off in order to plant it even deeper than you might have. I don't recommend like branches that are about this size. Maybe you could pull this one off, but I would not go any higher up the stem than that because you want to make sure that the plant has plenty of leaves to photosynthesize with and continue to make that energy it needs to grow. Another reason you might pull foliage off of one of your plants, even if it's not a tomato, before transplanting, is because the roots are going to be disturbed no matter what you do. And the fewer leaves that the roots have to support, the quicker your plant is going to bounce back from the transplant to a certain extent. So like these leaves, for example, they're not looking so great. Even if this wasn't a tomato, I would go ahead and pull those off just because the plant is currently putting energy into repairing and maintaining those leaves, and it doesn't need to be. It's got plenty of other healthy leaves. So I could pull these leaves off and help it have less foliage to support, have it have more energy to go into growing bigger rather than maintaining some of these leaves at the bottom that it doesn't really need anyway. Something that's really important when you're transplanting anything, whether you're planting seeds or putting plants in the soil, is that you want to make sure that it is well situated in the soil and it has good contact with the soil around it. If you just plop it in a hole and you don't fill in the hole or you don't press the dirt in around it, then it's going to have a hard time getting moisture from the soil around it, and the roots are going to have a hard time crossing that air gap in order to get into the soil around it. So you want to like firmly, gently, but also firmly press seeds and plants when you're transplanting into the soil, just so that they have that good solid contact with everything else around them. All right, and another general thing to think about when you're transplanting a bunch of plants is that you want to make sure that they're used to being outside before you go and put them outside. And this is called hardening off. What will happen if you don't harden them off, I actually don't have a good example because these are all hardened off. But what can happen is that you will get what's called sunburn on your plants. If they've been indoors under grow lights, that's not ever going to be as strong as being under direct sunlight. And if they go from being indoors only to directly outdoors all day in the hot sun, they're gonna get sunburned, they're gonna be sad, and a lot of times they will come back from that, but they might be stunted. They might not grow as fast for the rest of the season. So something that you want to do with any plant that you're transplanting from indoors to outdoors is harden it off, which means slowly, little by little, introduce it to more and more light. So that might look like setting your plants out for an hour around sunset the first day, and then maybe 2 hours before sunset the next day, or maybe similarly starting them out in the morning and bringing them in during the heat of the day, until eventually you've left them outside for at least 1 or 2 full days in the sun, in the kind of sun that they're going to be in once they are transplanted outside. All right, and then the last little thing I want to mention that is true for all transplanting is that you want to make sure that you water in really well after you transplant. If the plants have been watered but the soil around them hasn't, then this large amount of soil that's dry can actually suck the moisture out of the plant. So you just want to make sure that the entire area that you are planting into, and not just right at where the plant is really well and deeply watered. Alrighty guys, I'm going to go transplant out the rest of these, but if you have any questions, if there's something you felt like I didn't cover, go ahead and leave your questions in the comments below. I do try to get to everything. I'm starting to grow to a point where I can't always get back to everybody, but I do try. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you want to see the rest of my gardening basics series, I will put it up here for you. And until next time, I wish you happy gardening.